Welcome, everybody. This is Dr. Keesha Ewers, and I'm pleased to have my guest this evening be Geneen Roth, who is the author of 10 books, including the New York Times bestsellers When Food is Love, Lost and Found, and Women, Food, and God. He's appeared on many television shows such as 2020, The Today Show, and Oprah Winfrey. And her latest book that we're going to talk about this evening is This Messy, Magnificent Life, a Field Guide. Looks like that, by Geneen Roth. Welcome, Geneen. It's a pleasure to have you on this.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me on. It's great to meet you this way.
Yes, I know. In your work, in my Academy for Integrative Medicine Health Coach program, I use your work to help people assess for eating disorders and coming into a healthy and compassionate and sacred relationship with food and themselves, of course, because themselves are obviously at the root of all of that. And so I love having you here to talk about this latest book and your work, because I think you've profoundly changed a lot of people's lives throughout the years with bringing the sacred into the conversation. And that's what I most appreciate about your work. So you divided this book up into 3 parts. And I want you just to kind of go through and talk about this book, the latest one, and what your goal was, what your motivation was for writing it, and what you hope people will get out of it.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I started writing it about 7 years ago. It took 6 years to write and a year until it was done, until it, now. I started writing it because I realized that my relationship with food was pretty much healed, so to speak. I mean, I'm always in the process of refining it, learning more, loving that process, but it wasn't a source of suffering anymore for me. It wasn't an obstacle for me, which is quite amazing, since it had been, I would say, my number one nightmare and land of the hell realm for 17 years. And I realized that there were other areas of my life, like the fact that I woke up in a sort of negative trance, I would say, a trance of discontent, and just wedded to negativity. In fact, recently I said to my husband, I know I've been married to you for a long time, but really what I've been married to is a negative way of seeing everything. I'm an expert, or was, at making lemons from lemonade. Hand me lemonade and I would turn it into lemons. I mean, not always. Obviously, my relationship with food was not in that category. That was stellar for me. But I realized that I could use what I had done with food, a couple of different practices or processes or steps, I don't know what you want to call it, in the rest of my life, because that had worked so well with me with food. And I have been meditating for ever and ever, and been in therapy for just as long as I've been meditating. And somehow it wasn't translating to my everyday life. It just wasn't the way it did with food when I was very focused about my relationship with food. So I became very focused about the rest of my life, how I woke up, how I went through the days, what my thoughts were, what my beliefs were, what was driving me, so that the low-level anxiety and discontent and feeling of not being enough, worthy, would dissipate. I mean, I wanted to see if it could, without trying to get rid of it in the same way that I did with food, just turn towards it rather than away from it.
That's beautiful. So, you have a little spot in here in the book towards the end about meeting Eckhart Tolle and him hugging you and saying, what are you going to write about when you're no longer neurotic?
In fact, that piece was the piece I started the whole book with, believe it or not, even though it's towards the end of the book.
I got that.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. My response to him was, I don't know. And, is there ever going to come a time when I'm not neurotic? And so there was just a big silence when he asked me that. And, but it really got me thinking, and it got me wanting to really look at my life and how I was living it, because one of the pieces in the book, The Breaths I Have Left, is about realizing that we all have an allotted number of breaths to take in our lifetime. And I didn't want to spend one more breath mired in these feelings of, and I wouldn't say they were big. I wouldn't say the feeling of not being enough or worthlessness was running my life, but it was like a screen in the background, and that the colors of what else was going on in my life were always somehow mixed with the low-level anxiety, the discontent, the feeling of not being enough, of looking for what's wrong instead of what was right, of complaining, a sort of basic, I don't know, cynicism and hopelessness. Very low level though, but enough that it affected me daily.
Mm-hmm. It's uncomfortable and it affects your biochemistry. Oftentimes I'll have women come in and say, I would like bioidentical hormone replacement therapy. And, when I start scratching the surface and asking questions about why they're asking for hormones, it'll often be things that are held on to hurt from the past or trauma or, things that they haven't actually gotten to the root cause of and really healed and encapsulated in such a way that they've integrated it and made friends with it, dancing with the shadow. Right. And I always say, estrogen and progesterone and testosterone are not going to help them. This is something that goes off kilter because you've been this way for so long, and we can definitely put more in your bucket. But if there's a giant hole in the bottom of the bucket, then at the end of the day, you're nowhere, right? We need to actually, patch the hole in the bottom of the bucket. And so, it sounds like that's what you finally chose to do.
I did. I had been working so much at so many other things and somehow felt like, I was born with a piece of my DNA missing. There was a feeling of being damaged somehow at the core of me. And that it wasn't possible for me to live with this sense of, aliveness and positivity, not so that I'd be in denial of what was actually going on in the world, or, when something hurt or I felt rejected or there was sorrow, that I didn't feel it, but that my basic trend, my inclination was not going to be towards depression or negativity or lack of joy. And I didn't know if it was possible. And I really wanted to find out because, that I had a lot of abuse in my life. There was a lot of addiction, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, physical abuse, sexual abuse. And I had seemingly worked through a lot of it. I mean, there just wasn't anything else I could do to do that. I tried every kind of therapy there was. And it felt like, okay, I understand a lot. I've forgiven a lot. There's a lot here, and there's still this. So that's how I started the book. And I did discover, the good news was that I really did discover that it was possible. Not always, but that my whole relationship to that which caused me pain and suffering, to my thoughts, to my beliefs, to my identity of who I am and am meant to be in this world, that utterly did shift. And the same with my retreat students, because I work with them pretty closely too.
It's very interesting because what you're saying about your DNA and feeling like something's broken or missing, a hole, that's an existential problem that most humans arrive to at some point in their developmental stages, right? And I do a lot of genetic testing, and it turns out there are certain, we call them single nucleotide polymorphisms or SNPs, or they used to be called mutations. That there are these family lineages, and in addition to the family trauma that goes on for generations. And we have the power to turn those off. We know that now. And that's the most exciting time to be alive, I think, is now. Because we actually can do that, and we know that we have this neuroplasticity. We know we can do things to integrate because obviously therapy was bringing you awareness, but you weren't integrating it, right, into
Right.
all of your layers. And, that's the part when I give retreats and do this with my patients and my students, it's the same thing. It's like, you have to integrate. You can't just have this intellectual awareness.
No.
And you can't lip service forgive. It has to be
No.
cellular, it has to
Yes.
be at that deepest core level. And then you can actually turn those genes so that they manifest in a different way, which is really exciting. And that's really what you're talking about.
Yes, it is what we're talking about. And it is thrilling. And it's not that hard.
Right.
That's the amazing thing, that I thought, oh no, now I have to do, 30 years more work and I'm going to die before this is done. But it was just some simple practices. And one of them, which is what you're alluding to, which is what I call stand in your own two shoes, which is be in your body. I mean, to actually inhabit this, come out of your mind. It's what you were just saying about integrating. You can't just think it.
Right.
It has to be experiential. And it doesn't, sometimes when I say that to people, or when it was said to me, I was like,
what do you mean?
But the most interesting thing about me is my mind. And how do I do that? And so it's very simple. It's just beginning with feeling your feet on the floor, your butt in the chair, your back, becoming aware of your right hand or your left hand, feeling the sensations in your entire body. I mean, there are very simple things to do. It's not that complicated. And yet somehow we think it is, and that we don't belong to the tribe of humans for whom that is possible. That was one of my biggest things, the little match girl. I always felt like the little match girl standing outside in the cold with bare feet and rags, and it was not connected to reality at all. This is an inside feeling.
Right.
While a loving family was on the other side of the picture window roasting turkey and in their little velvet dresses and kissing and hugging each other. And I was never going to be part of that love. Mm-hmm. And so that, I think, was in some ways the deepest belief I had. It wasn't possible for me. And then it was, by doing a couple of very simple things, but consistently. It's not once that you do it. It's not twice that you do it. But, if they take 5 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever at different times during the day, 5-minute segments, so what? We spend 5 minutes so many times a day surfing the internet, looking at cute little videos of puppies and kittens. Why not spend that time with ourselves?
Right.
Yeah,
agree.
in a very kind way. I think kindness is sort of the element here. Yeah.
What I've seen is patients will come in my office and they'll say, "Oh, I've done so much therapy around that. I've done so much therapy around that." Yes. And then I say inside of myself, and yet here you are with autoimmune disease.
That's right.
Or still with a disordered eating process, right? And so therefore, that's not complete. And I honestly believe that we're not complete until we die, that when the breaths that we have allotted to us are finished. And I start my book with, my definition of hell is meeting the person I was meant to become. And I don't match that, right?
Right. Yeah, or getting to the end of your life and taking your last breath and feeling like you didn't really show up.
Exactly. You didn't light up to your full potential.
No.
And of course, that's what you're all about, is helping people do that. So you start with the sacred table and in your book. And I love that. And I would love for you to just kind of give a couple of highlights around that particular section.
Yeah, sure. I'm always interested in food and the relationship with food as one of the primary gateways to our core self, to our souls, to the center of the universe, as far as I'm concerned, because we have to eat every day. And because how and what we eat is an exact reflection, I think, you probably do too, of what we believe is possible. And, the longest time I didn't eat when I dieted. I stayed away from certain foods, but felt deprived and ashamed and out of control. And then I started moving towards, and I write much more about this and in this book, in the food section, that it was more about what I wanted to move towards, which was aliveness and life force and radiance, vitality, robustness, instead of what I was moving away from, which were the list of foods that didn't bring me, presence or life force. So that's where I started that section of the book, which, okay, I'd like to write about food now from what I'm learning now. And so if I'm remembering correctly, the first chapter is about enough and really what's enough, and understanding that unless we, as you said, patch the hole in the bucket, we're never going to feel like we have enough. And for me, realizing I had enough happened when we lost every cent of our money in 2008. And I went into immediate terror. I mean, talk about believing we didn't have enough. My husband was away. I had a couple of weeks to deal with this without him. And I started realizing then that unless I focused on what I did have, not what I didn't have, then I would always feel like I didn't have enough. It wasn't about what I actually had. And the same is true with the food on my plate. Unless when I'm eating, I'm actually present and I'm there and I take it in, really let myself have the goodness of it, I always feel hungry. I haven't received what the food had to give. And so then I walk around feeling empty. And I realized I was doing that with my entire life. I wasn't taking in what was there. And so that section of the book starts with that piece about enough. And then I also talk about weight loss, and I talk about how many of us, myself included in this, used weight, or at some point used our weight as a way of protecting or hiding ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so it's important to identify that and name that, because the adult in us says, yes, I want to be healthy. I want to lose weight. I want to do this. I want to do that. I want to do this with my life. But then if we're using food and or our weight to keep us hidden or protected, it's, there's no way that weight loss is going to happen and really stay off, because one is about survival and the other is about, I think it's a good idea and I'd like to do this and all that. But anyway, so there's that piece. And then there's the piece too where I talk about women tying up their energy in the obsession with food. And if we released that energy, what would it be like? If all the energy that all of us have tied up in obsession was released, I feel like it would be enough to run a nuclear power plant. It would be enough to light a city. It would be enough to change the world. And so I'm naming those things and, really talking about what's involved there. So that's what the first section of the book is about.
It's fascinating when you said this about, weight becoming a shield. A study that I talk about often, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. Have you heard of that before? The ACEs study?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So in 1995 to 1997 it was conducted, and Kaiser Permanente was running this great weight loss clinic that had fantastic results. And yet there were these women dropping out before they got to their goal. And when Dr. Folletti went back and started looking at why and interviewing them, it turns out that a lot of them were sexually abused in childhood. And, they started going, and then joined with the Centers for Disease Control and did this great big study of over 17,000 participants. And what they found is that a lot of adult obesity does have to do with childhood trauma. And indeed, all the chronic illnesses we see in our society today are linked to past stress in childhood and then beliefs we create. Not necessarily the stress, but what we create as kids with our brains, right? What you were saying before, your belief is you're not enough. Mine with my sexual abuse at 10 years old was, I have to be perfect to even survive, you know, and
Yes.
we always set ourselves up with these beliefs that are not sustainable, right? And they're impossible. In fact, I call them the impossible task. And so, you
Yes.
know, people will hear a story like yours or mine and say, well, I didn't have that. I had an Ozzie and Harriet kind of, you know, upbringing. But I always say, like, every child has trauma. And it can
Yes.
be in the form of being rejected on the playground or failing your first test or not making it to the top of the rope at the presidential challenge, right? Whatever it is,
Yes. Right.
you're going to create your meaning. And it can match somebody that's had, you know, these terrible, traumatic, horrible abuses, because that's your bar. Whatever your bar is where you set your meaning at, and it's your worst. So everybody's worst basically is the same because it's their worst. And so, you know, when you start hearing like Geneen talk, or, you know, me throw out there, yeah, I was sexually abused, I talk about this in my book, that doesn't exclude you from this process. So for those of you that are listening, so
No.
yeah.
And you know, what you were saying, Keesha, is one of the touchstones that I write about in This Messy, Magnificent Life,
Mm-hmm.
Which is that it's not the situation. Now, I'm not talking about as adults. I mean, as children.
Right.
I'm not talking about that. It's really important to say that out loud.
Mm-hmm.
But as adults, it's not so much the situation as the story we tell ourselves about the situation.
Exactly.
Our interpretations are what we take it to mean. And I see myself doing this daily. A friend doesn't answer a text or an email, and suddenly in the gap between me sending the email or text and no response, oh, I must have done X, Y, and Z. She decided on this or that.
Start making stuff up.
Totally. And the thing
Yeah.
is, unless we're really careful, this
Mm-hmm.
is where vigilance comes in. Unless we're really vigilant about this, it's so easy to merge the situation with the story and
Right.
believe that they're the same, that our opinion of something or our interpretation of something is 100% correct. And most of the
Right.
time, it's 100% incorrect. And
Maybe
so,
maybe 1% you've been correct and said, "See, I knew it," right? But you know, the 99% actually should weigh heavier than the 1%, but it doesn't.
it
You will always
definitely
say,
should.
"Oh, I knew it. I knew it."
Right. Because I think that another thing is that it's so seductive,
It is.
those stories, and the drama that they create and the juiciness. And, you know, I talk in the book about the not complaining practice that I took on. And I'm actually still doing that. That's been 2 years already. I took on, I'm not going to complain. And that was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Harder than giving up sugar because it didn't feel good in my body. Was actually, it was the same kind of, it was like scratching an itch. It was, but I want to tell you how hard my day was. And I want to tell you what this person didn't do that I thought they were going to do. And I want to complain about it. And I suddenly saw that I was complaining about something that had already happened. And there was nothing I could do about it. And so
Right.
there was no point in complaining. It was just like running in place. And so I decided, and also getting mired in more negativity. And so I decided to stop. I did it cold turkey. Now, I haven't always kept to it in the 2 years, but probably I could count on 2 hands, probably about 10 times, that I broke my commitment to myself, which I'm not exactly thrilled about. But anyway, it felt like a worthy thing to complain about, whatever it was that I broke it. But
Highly
then I
justified,
saw,
right?
yes, right, highly justified, justifiable anger, and how could they? And you know, sort of, you listen to people talk, they say things that are always like this. They say things like, who could do that? Who does that?
Right.
You know, and so let me get you on my side of me being the victim here, because as always,
Right.
when we complain, we're the victim. They done me wrong. And then, I mean, talk about not feeling powerful. Talk about just robbing ourselves of any kind of feeling of well-being, and the negativity, that the effect of that on our systems. Anyway, I decided to stop. My husband thought, and I wrote about this in, I think it was, I don't know, there's a chapter called The Crazy Ant in the Attic, about the voice in the head that keeps going on. And I don't know whether it's about that one or not, but my husband thought I had the flu. After I hadn't complained for 2 weeks, he thought I was sick.
Are you okay?
He thought, it was like, honey, are you doing okay? Because this isn't your usual conversation. And in fact, there were gaps. I have a couple friends who, when I talked about not complaining, said to me, I think that would take away all our topics of conversation. So anyway, it's interesting, the little things we do every single day that we don't realize we do. And that's what the book is about, really. It's about that. It's about paying attention and realizing that what you pay attention to grows. And how you spend your attention is how you spend your life. And kind of really grokking that. And it's like, okay, do I really want to spend my attention on this or not? Yeah.
It's so important. Every presidential election, I have to bring my patients and my students back to that again of, this is not something you have control over. Therefore, please don't waste your energy and your time, and your fight or flight mechanism in your body. Your adrenal glands do not need to be chasing the presidential election. The government's decisions about X, Y, or Z, the FDA, the EPA, the other party across the aisle, all of this stuff is beyond your control. Please worry about your own dharma, your own life purpose, and really focus, you know. And we have so many things to get us off our rails from the minute we turn on our computer to the time we go to sleep at night. And it creates this unfocused, discombobulated reality for so many people that affects their health, but also keeps you from reaching that full potential, so that you don't meet the person you are meant to become at the end of your life, because you've wasted so much time and talking and complaining about these things that you have absolutely no control over. So I think it's one of the biggest addictions that there is the addiction of control.
Yes. And I would say it's exacerbated now with the current political situation, that people are sort of living in a traumatic, hypervigilant fear state, nuclear war, tax laws, North Korea. I mean, there's so much going on, and it's a new curveball every day and people feel like, unless I tune in, I won't know, and I won't. Believe me, you'll know. And then when you know, like I was in Hawaii when that mistake went out about the nuclear missile that was supposed to be landing in 15 minutes. I had landed right after that, but I got a lot of texts. And what I realized in that moment was, okay, well, you know, when it's coming, you have no choice. So you do what you can. And I talked to friends who were there, and I asked them what they did. And they said they sort of talked to each other. They told each other they loved each other, and they felt complete with their lives. And that was that. I mean, did they want to die? No. But when it's out of your hands, you realize it's out of your hands. When there's an earthquake or a fire, which is how the book starts out, me packing to evacuate because of the fires in Northern California. It's out of your control. And then you know what to do. Right. But to live in that hypervigilant state every day is just, it's just.
Puts a hole in the bottom of your hormone bucket, lady.
Yes, it does. Exactly.
And it just eats away at your neurotransmitters, and it creates anxiety, right? So
yes, that's right.
I missed the whole missile about to head into the United States thing entirely, and I have to say, don't matter, doesn't matter. And I told my daughter that, who was following every movement of whatever government decision that was happening, and I said, stop it, just turn it off, you know. And I realized this, it was my father that taught me. I was pregnant with my first child way back in the 87, 89. And I was crying because there was yet another drive-by shooting in Dallas, Texas. And I thought, what am I doing bringing a child into this messed up world? Messy, right? The name of your book. And I was so upset by it. And my dad called right then and he said, what's going on? What's wrong? And I said, oh, I can't believe I'm bringing a baby into this, And he, I've never forgotten this. He said, Keesha, I want you to think back to when you were born. And he said, in 1965 in the United States, what was going on? And I said, oh, yeah, like all this Berkeley, riots about Vietnam and civil rights and, on the heels of McCarthyism, like really bad stuff, right? And he said, okay, so then how about when I was born? And he was born in 1945. And I said, oh, yeah, like genocide, right? Extermination of humans. And he said, what do you think people thought about that? And I said, yeah, okay. And then he said, what about when my mom was born and, it was World War I? And I said, okay, I get your point, that there's always going to be something because it's part of what we are supposed to learn being here. And, it's part of human nature. And so you can always kind of take the side that you do have control over and run with it, right?
Right.
Yourself.
Yes.
Yourself.
Yes. And that's how the title of the book came, This Messy, Magnificent Life. I realized there was no way of getting rid of everyday challenges.
No.
That people would get sick. There were going to be accidents. There were, on and on and on and on. I broke my back while I was writing this book. I had what was called the 4-month virus while I was writing this book.
No wonder it took you
there
all
was
this time.
So much. And so I realized it was about using the so-called messiness of our lives in the same way that I used the relationship with food, which was really messy when I started using it, as a doorway to the magnificence, as a doorway to expansion, as a doorway to joy, but not feeling like you have to get rid of it and have a different life in order to do that, because there isn't any way. There are always going to be those challenges.
Always. Yeah. And I think the expectation that somehow you're going to get to a place in your life when that doesn't happen is what brings a lot of suffering.
It does.
Realize, everybody, you will never get to a place where there are no challenges. This is part of human life on planet Earth. And so I think attachment to the expectation that somehow if I do everything right, or if I control all the variables I can control, I won't be challenged anymore and I won't suffer. And I think it's the very expectation that causes the suffering.
Yes, I think so. And also, I think it's the disappointment. I had that going. I had that going when I wrote my first book before you were born, Keesha. Oh, no. It was after you were born. That's right. If it was before you were born, we wouldn't be here having this conversation. But anyway, I had this piece called If Only I Had, Then I Would Be Happy. And it was about different things. And, one thing I discovered when we lost our money and I started interviewing financial advisors. After I realized that if I was vigilant about focusing on what I could find, not what I had lost, my whole mindset would change. Everything changed. Within a couple of weeks, I was happier than I'd ever been in my life, which is extraordinary given the loss we had and that there was no way of making it up. But what I saw was no situation was unworkable, was that every single situation, there was a way to be with it with kindness, and there was a way to use it as a portal, as a doorway, no matter what happened. Now I can't remember what I was saying that led me into that, but maybe you can. And if
that was it. You just said the very thing. Yeah. If only I had this, I would be happy. Expectations, right?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Right. So it was the financial advisors who said to me, every time they interviewed a prospective client and they asked the prospective client, what was their goal? whether it was to have $200,000 to retire on, $100,000 to retire on, $500,000, $5 million, no matter what it was, when they got there, they always raised the bar.
Always.
So they were never satisfied with where they
Same
were.
with weight loss, right?
Always, yeah. Yes. And, you know, if one of my favorite sayings is what somebody said to me in a workshop years ago, I would die to be as thin as I was 5 years ago when I would have died to have been thinner. So and I think part of it is just being in the moment. And also I will say, disengaging for what I call the crazy aunt in the attic, the voice of harshness and judgment and blame, that definitely is not our friends.
Yeah.
And we I think naming it is the first step, and then seeing that it's operating all the time, and then learning what your best way of disengaging is, whether it was humor or assertiveness. Everybody's got a favorite way that actually works, but separating yourself from it so that you're not, so when that voice comes in of, well, you said you wanted to make $100,000 and now you did, and that's really not enough. So what were you thinking when you said that? That's the crazy aunt in the attic. That's definitely the crazy aunt. No matter what you do, it's never good enough. And that really requires disengaging from.
I was a photographer many, many years ago when my children were small, and I used to love to shoot children and then also engaged couples. They were both the same. Their energy was sweet and open and you know, just authentic. And I remember shooting this one young woman with her fiance, and she kept saying, like, make sure you get this angle, or, you know, hide this. And she was gorgeous, of course, right? And I put down my camera at one point and I just said, you know, Becky, you're going to look back at these photographs that I'm taking today in 10 years, and you're going to say, wow, what I would give, right? To have that skin, to have that body. And I said, the minute that you start inhabiting the body you have with graciousness and appreciation and gratitude is the day that you never say to another photographer, make sure you don't get my bad side, you know? Right. And I said, I want you to always remember I said this. And sure enough, 15 years later, she came back and she had 4 children, and she said, oh, what I would give to look like I did. You shot me. And,
right.
And I get it now. And I said, yeah, it's a process. I mean, it's not something like a light switch, right?
Yeah.
It's a process of practicing the self-talk, and you have to keep practicing. And finally, as you look in the mirror, really being grateful for this body. And, you know, all the years that I worked in the intensive care unit in the hospital and saw that life can change on a dime. You know, you can be paralyzed in a second, you know, and to really say, oh, I'm so grateful for this moment, this breath, and this place that I am in my body right now. And then this next breath and this moment, right? And just stay right there. And then you don't have regret. And I think that's an important thing to try and leave the earth without, is regret.
I think that's true. And so, you know, a really good practice to have, which I do mention because I practice it every single day. When I wake up in the morning, I open my eyes, and as I said, I must counter my trend to negativity, because oftentimes when I open my eyes, the first thing I'll think is, oh, I didn't get enough sleep, or something I didn't get enough of will come. And so then that's a trigger for me. The negativity is a trigger for me to counter that with, and what's not wrong right now is the question that I will ask myself. Within 5 minutes of waking up, what's not wrong right now? And then many times during the day, in order to groove a new neural loop, I will ask myself, what's not wrong? And in a given moment, there are so many things that aren't wrong than there are wrong. Right. And so it's good to have these kinds of practices that are, what I said at the beginning, small and don't take a lot of time, but that you do consistently, because that's part of what the brain scientists say, is that when you do something with intensity and consistency, it really does change
It does.
the loops in the brain. You were talking about that plasticity.
Right.
Yes.
And not only your brain, but your genetics and how they're manifesting.
Yes.
So,
right.
Yeah.
So good. So
I'm a living, walking billboard for this, and so are you. My grandfather had RA. I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis 23 years ago. 6 months later, it was gone because I practiced these very things. And so,
yes.
You do not have to have the sins of the fathers.
No, so good to know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So you have a masterclass for people that buy your book.
I do.
Tell them about how to get a hold of it, and then also about this class.
The way you can get a hold of the book, you can go to JeneenRothBook.com, and you'll see a page that will lead you to buying the book. Of course, you could buy it from your local bookseller, your independent bookstore, Barnes & Noble, Amazon. Anywhere you buy the book is fine, of course. And that will, and if you send us the receipt, and we'll tell you on that page how to do it, it's not complicated, that will open the door for you to be in the masterclass that I'm teaching, which is called Women, Weight, and Power, Releasing the Energy of Obsession. And so that is about what we were talking about before, Keesha, to have our life energy freed up so that we can actually do what we know we can do. I mean, there's always that promise that we know that we're unique and we're not like anybody else. And it's a different life here than it is, for instance, in your body or my husband's body. Our lives are different. And so that class is about releasing the energy of obsession. And so at JeneenRothBook.com, you'll find all the information. The deadline for doing all of this ended yesterday. And then I extended it because there was a whole group of people that I didn't tell about. And so I extended it to tonight. And then when you and I were talking before this, I realized, there are more people here. So I'm extending it again till Wednesday
again,
night.
you guys. You only have a 24-hour period, though.
48 hours.
Yeah. Well, by the time people view this, it may just.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
So hop on it.
Hop on it. It helps. I find that it helps to have a deadline because it puts a little fire under my butt. And so if I think I have forever, then I sort of putter along. But when there's a deadline, it's helpful. And that was true with writing my book too. It's just true. When I have to get out of the house to be somewhere at a certain time, I get out of the house. And so with this, there is a deadline. But the thing is, the book itself is such a joy. It's the ticket. The book is the ticket to the masterclass, but the book is also the ticket to joy. I was interviewed by somebody the other day about the book on our sort of world premiere event that we had, which you can find out by going to my website. And she kept saying, every chapter is my favorite chapter. When I would talk about a chapter, she'd say, that's my favorite chapter. No, that's my favorite chapter. So the book, from what I'm told,
it's a lot of fun. It's really great.
Like having a friend next to you who's willing to reveal all the deep, dark secrets that you haven't wanted to tell anybody. And suddenly there's somebody telling them, and you don't feel so alone. That's what I keep hearing over and over from people who are reading.
Well, I love that you have Annie Lamont doing the introduction, because she always talks about her thighs as the aunties, and you've got the crazy aunt in the attic. So aunties are getting a bad name, but they are very funny, because you and Annie both give funny voices to your crazy aunties and your aunties on.
Yes, we do, don't we? Yeah. Right. It's good It's good to name those.
Yeah, I agree.
It's really, really good to name them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. And I'm so happy that you've got this book out, because it's going to bring a lot of joy, not just to myself, but to all of our listeners and everyone else. And thank you so much for the work that you're up to in the world.
Oh, thanks, Keesha. It's been such a pleasure being with you and talking to you and connecting with you. Yes, yes, good.
All right, everybody, get the book, get the masterclass, and get joyful.